Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you. I just came from New York, and that means cold, and it's nice to be in a pleasant environment once again. My name is Charles Moore, and I want to welcome you very much to this celebratory event of Stanley's latest book. We don't know if it's his last book, Jesus Changes Everything. We're just very pleased that you took the time to join us today. And I want to especially thank the Anglican Episcopal House of Studies, who really helped bring this event together. And special thanks to Timothy Kimbrough and Liz McQuaid, and also to the Div School to provide such a wonderful venue for this occasion. Now, before Brian Zahnd, our guest presenter, and Stanley give their remarks today, I would like to just briefly share with you how this book came about. How did a small publisher, and we are small, Plow Publishing, get the renowned theologian Stanley Hauerwas to write another book? I'm to blame. 40 years ago, Stanley ruined my life. And so I wanted to get even. Seriously, I was a doctoral student in the early 80s in an ethics and public policy program at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I had great expectations upon entering this program, but I found myself gradually becoming quite disillusioned about what it was I was studying, and in particular, with what the philosophical community deemed to be the ethical project. Enter Stanley. When I began reading his early works, something started to shift inside me. And then when his book, The Peaceable Kingdom, came out, something seismic happened. Uh-oh. Bam. We got the ethical project all wrong. The liberal ideals of autonomy and neutrality were neither autonomous nor neutral. In fact, they imploded on the myth that we can live without myths. Disoriented and not just disillusioned, I eventually left the doctoral program and shifted my studies to theology. My Christian identity became liberated. And thanks to Stanley, I could now do ethics without apology as a committed Christian. After teaching at an evangelical seminary for 10 years, my earlier disillusionment started to creep back in. If I couldn't do Christian ethics without Christ, then I couldn't do Christian ethics without the church either. Thank you, Stanley. By now, Stanley's project had thoroughly gotten a hold of me, and my colleagues thought it had thoroughly poisoned me. If I couldn't do ethics without Christ, nor without the church, then what? Which church? What kind of church? The American church? The seeker-friendly church? The psychotherapeutic church? The social justice church? None of these options worked for me. Thank you, Stanley. Stanley's poison kept flowing through my veins. And so I finally decided to do simply what Stanley implied I should do in his writings. My wife and I left our teaching positions and all our belongings and moved 2,000 miles away to join the Bruderhof community in New York. This is a kingdom-centered community that shares all things in common, inspired by Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and the witness of the earliest Christians. To be rich and a disciple of Jesus is to have a problem, writes Stanley. You will read this and find out what kind of problem and what the solution might be. For my wife and I, moving to the Bruderhof was one way to address this problem. After joining the Bruderhof community, I never stopped reading what Stanley wrote. In fact, I started up a correspondence with him. In my role at Plow Publishing, the publishing arm of the Bruderhof community, I periodically turned to him to give us feedback on what we were publishing. And for over 30 years, Stanley has generously given us his time and insights. He's not only helped Plow to keep current, but has made some significant contributions to our flagship publication, the Plow Quarterly. How many of you are familiar with the Plow Quarterly? Thank you. That's awesome. So, about this book, Jesus Changes Everything. Despite his retirement, I felt compelled to approach Stanley about a book idea. Would he be interested in writing something for Plow? My thought was a small book that had its focus on following Jesus. I really doubted whether he would have the time, interest, or strength to do another book. I approached Stanley with the idea, and to the surprise of both of us, we got quite excited and were eager to work on something together. The selections in this book are ones you might be familiar with. However, this is not a Hauerwas reader. This book is a cohesive attempt to express both the mind and heart of Stanley. And unlike some of his other books, it has a singular focus, a focus that has always mattered most to Stanley, Jesus and what it means to follow him. In this respect, Jesus Changes Everything is not new. Who Jesus is, his birth, his life, his teaching, crucifixion, and resurrection, and what he proclaimed has been the backdrop of pretty much everything Stanley has ever written. And it's easy to forget this because Stanley has written on so many topics and engaged in such a vast array of theological and philosophical sources. One can lose sight of what fundamentally forms his frame of reference: the story of Christ and the church that tells, enacts, and bears witness to this story in the world. This story is so good, so subversive, so true, that when it is fully embraced, a new world is made possible. Indeed, Jesus changes everything. An alternative social order is birthed. That order is called the church. A life together that is far better than what the world can offer, and one that challenges the kind of Christianity that obscures and trivializes and politicizes Christ's name. Now, even though Stanley's vocational home has been the academy, this book is written for you and for me, for the church, for anyone who is tired of Christianity as usual. Its aim is to grab a hold of our imaginations so that we might become formed anew into the image of Christ. And this is why we have invited Brian Zahnd, a pastor, not an academic, to join us today and to speak to us. Brian is the founder and lead pastor of the Word of Life Church in St. Joseph, Missouri. With its roots in the Jesus movement of the 1970s, the Word of Life Church intentionally blends contemporary culture and music with ancient liturgy and sacrament in a way that seeks to give authentic expression to the kingdom here and now. Brian is a passionate reader of theology and philosophy. He's a real pastor theologian in my mind. He's an avid hiker, a would-be mountaineer, extremely enthusiastic about long-distance pilgrimages, about music, literature, and anything having to do with Bob Dylan. Like Stanley, Brian has authored many books. He has also been a fan and supporter of our publishing efforts. The first time I met Brian was at an informal dinner party with mutual friends of ours. When he walked through the front door of the house, he immediately thanked me for my book on Kierkegaard, entitled Provocations, and then proceeded to quote, by memory, several sections from the book. Now, I'm not sure if this is what Brian normally does, but who can't help but like a guy like that? But more importantly, Brian is here because his books are good. They are thoughtful, honest, generous, and timely. He writes the kind of books that Plow likes to promote. His most popular book, Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God. Here, Brian wrestles with subjects like Old Testament genocide, the crucifixion, atonement of Christ, eternal punishment, the final judgment in Revelation. And unlike Puritan revivalist Jonathan Edwards, Zahnd maintains that the summit of divine revelation for sinners is not God's wrath, but God's love. In his book, Farewell to Mars, he shares his own journey from being a war crier to becoming a peacemaker. This book cost Brian dearly. The aftermath of that book, over 1,000 members of his congregation left his church. In his latest book, Postcards in Babylon, the Church in American Exile, Brian argues that Christians are called to be exiles in the empire. The gospel is that Jesus is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, and consequently, the gospel will always conflict with anything, including Christian nationalism, that baptizes the power structures of this age. Quite simply, you cannot serve God and empire. Nor can you use the power of empire to force your version of God's will on people. Brian has been and is on a spiritual and intellectual journey, one which in my mind has become increasingly radical or Jesus-centered and more boldly critical of the church as we know it in America. Brian would like to give some remarks on each of the sections of this book. Thank you, Brian, for coming all this way to speak to us. Let's give Brian a warm welcome.
Thank you, Charles. My life has followed a rather different trajectory than that of Stanley Hauerwas. And yet we've arrived at a very similar conviction that Jesus really does change everything. Charles has given you a bit of my context. Yes, I come from the Jesus movement. I'm just a 66-year-old Jesus freak. That's all I lay claim to. Had a very dramatic conversion in the heyday of the Jesus movement. Was leading a ministry by the time I was 17 that turned into a church by the time I was 22. This is not a pattern to follow. It's just what happened. By the time we got to the 90s, the church had grown exponentially into the thousands. But as I entered my 40s, I began to feel the thinness of it. It felt too compromised, too consumer-oriented, far too American. And so I didn't know what to do other than to back up and start with the church fathers. And after a few years of intensive reading the church fathers, I finally was able to maybe break into more contemporary theology. And among those that were the most profound influence on my thinking and thus my preaching was Stanley Hauerwas. And yes, he probably is responsible for producing the church shrinkage movement of the congregation I led. So yes, we did lose 1,000 people, but we're in a good place today, and we're happy, and God has blessed us. And Jesus changes everything. This wonderful, I would describe it as a wonderful distillation of all things Stanley Hauerwas. Charles, I might say, A New World Made Possible, the subtitle. That's good. I probably would have called it Barrel-Proof Hauerwas. Please drink responsibly, or something like that. So here's a few passages, highlights that stood out to me as I read through this a couple of times. We begin with part one, following Jesus. Stanley writes, "The gospel is about this man, Jesus the Christ. It's not about love or some love ethic, but a call of adherence to this man, God's very Son, who has bound our destiny to his, who has made the story of our life his story." Yeah, the gospel is not an abstract formula. The gospel is not a plan of salvation. The gospel is not four spiritual laws, a Roman road, how to go to heaven when you die. The gospel is a story. It's the story of Jesus Christ. We can tell it very succinctly, death, burial, and resurrection. We can tell it much more fully, from virgin born, babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger, to the empty tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. We can have the director's cut edition that takes us from Genesis to Revelation, creation to new creation, but it remains a story and not a formula. And to preach the gospel essentially is to tell this story, and then trust that Jesus Christ is fascinating enough, captivating enough, that as his story begins to seep deeply into our stories, we are transformed. And this is probably what we mean by salvation. Second part of this book is called Good News. Stanley writes, "Jesus does not seek to morally improve nor violently overthrow Rome, not because he was outnumbered, but because his kingdom is a radical alternative both to the violence of Rome and to those who would overthrow Rome with violence, but also to those who would uphold the status quo." Well, we're still living in the wreckage following Constantine, where we decided somewhere along the way, if we have a Christian emperor, then maybe we can build a Christian empire. And then that challenges what we mean by confessing that Jesus is Lord. So is Caesar Lord or is Jesus Lord? We can't get rid of Jesus. What are we going to do? And he essentially gets demoted to Secretary of Afterlife Affairs, where Jesus' task is to get us into heaven when we die, but pretty much we let Caesar run the world. And then the role of the church is to serve as a chaplain to the empire, or act as priests of the status quo, because really we can't imagine that the world could be any other way. And yet, that's exactly what this book does. A new world made possible. We need to advocate for the liberation of the Christian imagination and not accept the terms that are constantly dictated to us. And talking about Rome, really what we mean is we're talking today about America. I've been a pastor for 43 years. And I will say this: the greatest single challenge to the pastoral vocation in America is that we are tasked with making disciples of people who are already thoroughly discipled into the rival religion of Americanism. And this is what makes it so very difficult. America is a behemoth. It's so big, so pervasive, that it's not one thing, it's four things. Yes, it is a nation with its 50 states and all of that. It's a culture. I've been in 50 nations, but I've never left America. I mean, American culture is global. Outside, it's America. And as a nation and as a culture, there's much to be critiqued, but there's also much that is admirable and inspiring. But America is also an empire. By empire, we mean rich, powerful nations who believe they have a divine right to rule other nations and a manifest destiny to shape history according to their agenda. As an empire, the church is a rival to the sovereignty of God and the lordship of Jesus Christ. But finally, and most disconcertingly, America is a religion. A religion complete with founding myths and founding fathers and holy documents and holy places and holy days and liturgical gestures and all that goes with it. And so we are tasked with trying to make disciples of people who are already thoroughly discipled into a rival religion. And that brings us to the third part of God's alternative society, which is how I understand the kingdom. The kingdom of God. What is the kingdom of God? It's God's alternative society in the person of Jesus Christ and those that connect our lives to him. Stanley writes, Christians are concerned about the societies in which they exist, but our task is not to make the world apart from Christ into the kingdom of love. I like that kind of provocative statement. Though we are certainly to be characterized by love as followers of Jesus, that's for sure, Christians are not ambassadors of an abstract universal love. Rather, we are ambassadors of a concrete and particular Christ, who we confess is the very Logos of God, crucified and risen. And there is this transcendent aspect to the gospel we preach, because without transcendence, Christianity degenerates into politics, by which I mean partisan politics. Stanley also writes, it is good that we burn with passion for justice. Yes. It is good that we burn for the victims of a system that keeps them down. Yes. The only problem with such a passion is that it can put us on Judas' side. I told you this is barrel-proof, Hauerwas. I see that. Judas betrays our Lord with a kiss. Why a kiss? Why not, if all he's doing is going to profit 30 pieces of silver and then run away, why not just lurk in the shadows, point him out to the chief of police and say, that's the one. That's the one. And you take on the money and run. But he doesn't do that. He comes up to Jesus and gives his rabbi the customary kiss. Why? Because Judas wants to remain a disciple. But he wants to remain a disciple on his terms. He wants Jesus to launch the violent revolution that will overthrow Herod and Caiaphas and Pilate and ultimately Caesar. And he thinks that he can back Jesus into a corner. And yet Jesus refuses to do that. He says, no more of this. Put up your sword. Those that live by the sword die by the sword. So we are called to be involved in sowing seeds of peace, which is part 5. Sowing seeds of peace. Stanley asks us, what could it mean then to rise from the table of unity we call Eucharist and kill one another in the name of national loyalties? From Constantine, there is a trajectory that eventually lands a Christian continent in the reality of 2 world wars where millions of Christians are killing one another in the name of their national allegiance. We'd hoped that such days were behind us, and yet for the past 3 years, the greatest number of war deaths year by year has been Orthodox Christians killing Orthodox Christians. When I speak like this or write like this, of course, Hitler always shows up. I mean, immediately, someone's going to bring, but what about Hitler? I understand that we may need to answer that question or grapple with it at least. I don't know that there's a good, simple answer. And I'm willing to have that discussion, but I resent always starting the discussion in 1940. What are we going to do now? What are we going to do now? I say at least we must first ask the question, how was it that Hitler was able to wage his blitzkrieg with baptized soldiers? What had happened to the church that national allegiance trumped everything else, and there was no longer any consideration about how Christ might inform us concerning war, violence, and the use of the sword? And then we come to the final part of Jesus Changes Everything, politics of witness. This is the part that speaks to me the most powerfully. In our current moment in America, our most pressing theological need right now is to get our political theology correct. And I just want to say, no one has shaped, informed, helped my political theology more than Stanley Hauerwas. I mean, I'm just a kid from Savannah, Missouri, trying to bring some Hauerwas to the common person. That's pretty much what I'm doing in the realm of political theology. And so Stanley writes, and this is very typical of his thought, the first social task of the church, the people capable of remembering and retelling the story of God we find in Jesus, is to be the church and thus help understand the world itself as the world. Our task as the church is not to change the world. Now, we love that kind of rhetoric. Change the world. It's very good in rallies and youth conferences and all kinds of movements. Let's change the world. I'm going to suggest that's not our job. That's not our task. Our task is far more modest. Our task is simply to be that part of the world already changed by Jesus. And that simply has to be enough. Because if we become intoxicated with the idea that it is our task to change the world, then we find it almost irresistible to reach for the most immediate means of changing the world, which is to possess Caesar's sword. Or the ring of power, if you want to be more Tolkien about it. What happens when the church sets out directly to change the world? Directly. So our task is to change the world. Let's go about it the most efficient and swift way. When the church does that, it doesn't change the world. It simply becomes the world under a particular religious banner. But it's still just the world. So these days, I find my consolation in the confession that Jesus is the Savior of the world, that ultimately the world will be saved, because this is the task the Father has given unto the Son. God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world. If all we need to do is condemn the world, a minor prophet would do, but God sent His Son not to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. So I'm content to allow Jesus to be the Savior of the world, and our task is simply to have these enclaves of an expression of what a saved world might look like. Stanley goes on to say, because we assume that democracies protect our freedoms as Christians, we may well miss the ways in which the democratic state remains a state that continues to wear the head of the beast. In this respect, democracy has been a particularly subtle temptation for Christianity. Christians have never killed as willingly as when they have been asked to do so for freedom. Freedom. What a slippery, subtle, seductive word. Freedom. Sometimes freedom is just another word for having the capacity to kill. We can follow the beast, or we can follow the lamb. What we cannot do is tame the beast and ride the beast into the New Jerusalem. That won't work. Stanley continues. People rightly complain that the political agenda of conservative Christians looks suspiciously like the political agenda of secular conservatives, while liberal Christians espouse the same social position as secular liberals. I would say it this way. The problem with the Christian right and the Christian left is that Christian is reduced to adjective duty in service to the all-important political noun. What really matters is right or left. And Christian is just a label of endorsement. Jesus is trotted out as a mascot for one side or the other and forced to say, I am Jesus Christ and I approve this message. Tomorrow, I fly back to conduct an Ash Wednesday service in our church. By the way, tomorrow's my birthday, and there's something apropos about your birthday landing on Ash Wednesday. Happy birthday, you're gonna die. The day after that, I lead a 3-day retreat, a Lenten retreat. And the theme of our retreat this year is discipleship, entering Lent with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'll speak 4 times, and in one of my talks, I'll quote this powerful passage from Jesus Changes Everything. Jesus is Lord. Lord is not a democratic title. It is a truthful designation for the one we worship and obey. We have authority to testify to the truth that Jesus is Lord. This is not some general truth that can be known without witnesses. A truth known only to witnesses to Jesus cannot help but be a profound challenge to the status quo, because the status quo is based on the assumption that whatever is true must be available to anyone. Christians are not anyone. We are a people who Jesus says will be hated and even put to death. But if Jesus is who he says he is, what choice do we have? After all, we did not elect Jesus. He elected us. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. You are really Hauerwasian to the bone. Okay, for the remainder of our time, what we're going to do is we're going to invite Stanley to come up, sit with Brian and myself. And Stanley will give some remarks from what I'm sure, Brian, you've just said. And then we'll give a chance for you to ask questions. Around 2-ish, we'll kind of break up the formal time, and then you'll have a chance to meet Brian and Stanley in the back, get books, talk with them, and so forth. I want to say one thing. I'm not going to go through all the accolades and everything that Stanley has accomplished. Most of you already know. But I want to tell one little story. A few years ago, I was having lunch with Stanley, and I asked him, why do you think the Protestant church is dying? And he looked up at me and said, because God's killing the church. Okay, so why is he killing the church? And without batting an eye, it's because we Christians don't speak truth to one another. I can tell you that Stanley, with humility, is willing to speak truth. And that's what makes him someone that you need to take seriously. And I think most of us have been impacted in some way or another by the truth that he speaks. What he's going to say today, I have no idea. I mean, he may elaborate on more about why God is killing the church. But let's give Stanley a warm welcome.
A few years ago, I got a phone call from an editor at The Atlantic. And he says, I think it's time that you should try to write for The Atlantic. And I said, well, that's a good idea. Let me think about it. So I thought about it for a few days. And I called him back and said, I think I've got a great idea for a article. I'd like to call it Secularist in the Hands of Flaccid Christians. And he said, Well, that's interesting. I said, you don't get it, do you? He said, get what? I said, it's a play on Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He said, I didn't read much Edwards. I suppose that I tell that as someone that's somewhat embarrassed about being focused in events like this, because the things I say suggest that I should live better than I do. But I feel like, honestly, you have to hold out what you think you've discovered as true, even if it passes judgment on yourself. And I suppose when I hear the sound bites that people seem so attracted to, that I specialize in, I think that has to do with a fundamental theological and philosophical move that I want to make explicit. And that is, to put it straightforwardly, if you need a theory of truth to know that Jesus was raised from the dead, worship that theory, don't worship Jesus. Mm-hmm. Now, what that does is suggest that if you start trying to find a basis for saying why it is you're worshiping Jesus prior to coming to terms with the witness of people to Jesus, then you're never going to make it as a Christian. Now, that move of trying to find a basis to say why it is you think Jesus was raised from the dead, if you start with that move, you end up as a liberal because you think you're getting to choose your story rather than the story that God has benefited you by through the witness of other people. Because that is the reason why there's no Christianity without witness. And witness is necessary as a correlative of the particularity of the God we worship as Christians. And that means that we depend upon one another to be who we've discovered Jesus has made us. That's where I take it that some people, the reason that people become attracted to some of the things that I've done is because there are insights there. And insights are very precious, and they only come from the fact that you find yourself committed to certain modes of life and thought that force you to say things you may well want to take back because of the trouble that you've gotten into by saying them. So what Brian, let me give you an example of just a move that is crucial to how I think about nonviolence. Where do you get the word war from? People can think that you don't have all the criteria of just war, but you still have to go to war. The very fact that you use the language of war already legitimates what you're going to do that Christians should not agree to. Why don't we call it slaughter rather than war? Well, Jesus, that's an insight I don't want to have, but I've had it. So you have to take responsibility for it as part of the way you learn to think. So it should be the case that you don't want to be influenced by me.
Too late.
But it's just a way to call attention to the philosophical moves that have shaped the way I think in a way that the way I think makes me think. I always worry about how I think because I will get you in more trouble than I've been in.
That's true.
That's awesome.
Right. That's not much, but it's enough to get us going.
Okay, so this is a chance for you to ask Stanley a question, or Brian. There's a roving mic somewhere. Okay, in the back, my colleague from Plow is standing up. He's raising. Joe, just raise your hand and be happy to entertain any questions. And while the mic is coming, so afterwards, make sure to take advantage of some of the special deals we're giving to students. There is going to be an event tonight, not with Stanley, but with Brian at the Poor Tap Room. It's called the Plow Meetup. You're very welcome to join us at 7 o'clock as well. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much for this amazing event. On the way here, I was driving and I was listening to a podcast, and it was two Christians talking about how they don't use the word Judeo-Christian because the implications of it, not to demean Jewish people, et cetera, et cetera. And I felt like they missed the golden opportunity that Judeo-Christian ideas were placed underneath the United States in a certain period in America's history to, I think, capture this idea of a captured church, that essentially we are one package in this melting pot America, church underneath America, America under the flag, in the world. And it made me think, like, in the future, as so many people right now are discovering, their understanding of evil was built on World War II and a paradigm that we lived from World War II, and we begin to examine that and maybe jettison that idea, not having great infrastructure of pacifism and pacifist thought and et cetera, that could really balkanize the church. It could break down that really unified Judeo-Christian world where churches and religions as a whole were really buddy-buddy because they were underneath the state, which was essentially, baptizing them as their ambassadors going forth. So, I don't know, thinking about what to be a part of the church in the future in this kind of new age when the church is really going to make much more of a difference as a head over against being, subsidiary to the country. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on what it would look like to be that church without a great amount of contest? Because I could see even right now the Orthodox and the Catholic and the, various kinds of Protestant churches kind of on the online space competing for that space.
No Jews, no Jesus. No church, no Jesus. So what we are recovering is the crucial particularity of this man who died on a cross, making present to Christians God's promise to Abraham. And therefore, at the heart of my work has been the Bardian particularity of who Christ is. And that particularity will drive you right to God's calling of a people that we call the Jews into the world to live as a sanctified people that refuse to be that refuse to let the narrative that determines their lives lost. And that means, what oftentimes people don't get is the absolute necessity of the story of Israel being part of the story of Christ that makes it possible for us to live across time and space in a way that we don't think we're getting to make our lives up. So certainly it has been the case that I suppose another way to put it is I'm a historicist all the way down. You don't start off with some general idea of thinking, I know where I am. It is a constant challenge to know how to tell the story of the world more accurately than the world can tell it of itself. And the Jews have had training in that a hell of a lot longer than we Christians have. And we have much to learn from them in the future.
Yeah, I've heard Stanley talk about how the Jewish people of the diaspora from the first century up until the modern state of Israel are really a model for how the church could be and probably should be present in the world, and that they're dispersed everywhere with no particular nation state as their own. They can function as they can in various nations, but always with a primary allegiance to their faith. Of course, that makes that kind of people very susceptible to persecution. And I don't know if you wrote that in a book or I heard that in some interview, but that stuck with me. If the church could continue to learn from the Jewish people, especially how they lived during their diaspora.
I just remembered there was something I wanted to respond to Brian about, which I'll go ahead and do it now. I don't know who in the hell he is. One of the things that I haven't done is have any knowledge of the evangelicals that have risen in among us over the last 50 years. But he represents evangelicalism going to seed by becoming more within the great Christian tradition. And I admire that. It gives some hope.
There's a question there and there.
This is for Stanley or Brian. There have been several articles in the past few weeks, including one in the Times this week, about the decline of the church has finally ended and is perhaps going to reverse now. And that it's being driven mainly by young people coming to church. If you were to imagine us as a room of 20-year-old inquirers or seekers, what would be, at the first class with this group, what would be sort of your main bullet points for us, assuming we don't know very much about Christianity, which is probably a safe assumption with most 20-year-olds today?
Well, the answer in general is always read C.S. Lewis. I think I would use the Gospel of John as a way to start. It's a compelling account that has the kind of general claims that offer the necessity of allegorical interpretation, and it's just so damned interesting. I mean, one of the things when if I had an apologetic strategy, which I'm not sure I do, but one of the things that a word that I think is important for attracting younger people today is Christians are just so damned interesting. What can make us interesting if not reading a document like the Gospel of John and determining one's place in the world? One of the theological issues that is at the heart of what I've done is that the church world duality is more fundamental than nature grace. It seems like a technical theological point, but it's damned important, because how you respond to situations like that depends so much on an account of the world in which we find ourselves that has insight that has been produced by truthful worship of God in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. If we could just be interesting again, that would be an evangelistic witness that I think God would enjoy.
Yeah, I'm familiar with, the articles like that you're talking about, and it seems to me that modernity is finally about to exhaust itself. Its endless criticism and rejection of tradition has just become wearisome. But what I might say to this imagined group of 20-somethings is, don't just go back 1,000 years to a romanticized medieval Christendom. If you're looking for rootedness, go all the way back. Go all the way back to Jesus, the Gospels. This is what Stanley's saying. And primitive Christianity. Don't just back up 1,000 years so that you can try to recover Christendom, because that's not coming back. Go all the way back to the true roots of Christian faith. I'd probably say something like that. And then we get them in the Gospel of John so we can become damn interesting Christians.
And then give them the book, Jesus Changes Everything. Okay, I saw it right there.
Thank you. I was taken by the idea of a new world made possible, but not focusing on changing the world, focusing on being the church. And I work in the spiritual formation world, and I was wondering if you could speak to that same principle at work in a vision that a new life is possible, but not focusing maybe so much on changing the self as being a follower of Jesus and being close to Jesus. And just wondering if that same kind of principle of indirection applies at that level.
It clearly should. The question is can I envision what it looks like, what it would look like? I'm not a pious person. It just doesn't come straightforward to me. I like pious people, but I'm not one. How you learn to pray, it seems to me would be at the heart of trying to respond to your question. And prayer never comes easy to me. Though it's interesting. One of the little books that I've done that I get more response to is Prayers Plain Spoken. Because what those prayers, I suppose, exhibit, at least I think they exhibit, is you should never think you need to protect God. If you think you need to protect God, it's not the God you should worship. Exactly. Too often our understanding of piety is just another way of thinking of sanctimoniousness and how to live enjoying a God that would call us out of the wilderness to enjoy the time we get, as the time that has been given to us, should result in people of genuine joy. And if I have any image of the change that might come, it's that it's wonderful to live around the people of joy.
Yeah, I would say the church that I'm a part of, at the very core of it, is spiritual formation. That's happened over the last 15, 20 years. I do a thing called prayer school. That's a fancy term for basically a 5-hour program where we just give people the prayers. And so these are the prayers you need to pray. And I have taught it now 101 times. And I only do it by, people have to badger me and ask me to do it. But you see the depth of interest there. People want to learn how to pray. And I think it actually is possible to have spiritual formation rather than events or that sort of thing at the core of a local congregation. I mean, we've done it, so I know it's possible. And it's what makes the biggest difference. That's more than anything what changed our church. And I would say as a pastor, it took me a long time, too long, but eventually I did learn it. The single most important thing I do as a pastor is teach people how to pray well. And basically that's just giving them the prayers, but also showing them actually kind of why these prayers matter and how to pray them. And so that's the hope I have for the future, that the church could be more contemplative and more rooted in spiritual formation.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then please, afterwards, ask your question to either.
Hey, good afternoon. I grew up in a conservative evangelical home, and my growing up was in late 70s, 1980s, 1990s. I remember the Moral Majority, the Christian Coalition, and I remember being as an evangelical feeling, threatened by the political culture out there, and had the marriage of America and Christianity. All the things you're talking about, that was my upbringing, and Stanley Hauerwas definitely helped explode that in me. My question is, we're in Durham, and I can see the current administration, from my point of view, is pretty terrifying. It seems like the easiest thing for Christians that aren't maybe politically conservative, who might be more or politically liberal or progressive, it seems like the easiest thing to do would take that whole evangelical approach, gut the content, fill in your own content, and then return the favor. I don't know if that makes sense. I kind of wonder, it seems like there's just a real danger in Christians afraid of the current administration to repeat these same Constantinian mistakes that the right has made, but they'll just do it with different content. And I didn't know if you had anything to say to that, if you have any ideas of what you think some of the pitfalls and dangers are for non-conservative Christians as we approach this time, and if you had any advice to, again, not repeat the same mistake, but with different content.
There was a book written called Christianizing the Social Order some years ago. Do you know who wrote it? Walter Rauschenbusch, the great social gospeler of American Christianity, a great man, but he was on the left. Basically, he was a religious socialist. We forget that American nationalism was fundamentally spawned by the religious left in America. What we are in the position, they were terrific people, stood for a lot of good things. Jerry Falwell took them over. And now the question is how do we as Christians find a critical stance within the world in which we find ourselves that is neither left nor right, but is a politics that helps us discern the temptations that follow from our lostness. My moniker, we live in a world in which people believe they should have no story except a story they chose when they had no story. That's called freedom in America. Is a challenge for us to recognize that there is a politics to our being a people who understand that we didn't choose our story. God has chosen us to be witnesses to God's reality in a narrative that makes life purposeful. I think that one of the evangelical moves that is associated with developing that kind of politics is one of the good things about being a Christian today, and there's not a lot of good things about being a Christian today. But one of the good things about being a Christian today is God has given us something to do. That's a wonderful thing, to have something to do. I mean, what does Donald Trump think? I mean, he's such a mess because he doesn't have anything to do other than to create misery for other people. So there is a politics to the very character of the lives that are made possible by a church that gives people something to do.
So true. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Stanley. And I want to give you both a chance to step through so you can get ahead of
Wait a minute,
everyone.
there's something I need to say before we do that, and that's to say, thank you, Charles. I mean, this is Charles's book.
Oh my. Oh my. I'm in trouble.
I mean, he put it together.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's really good. I wished I'd have said that.
Okay. Before this devolves any further, I'm going to let you two go ahead and let's give them a round of applause.